Hi there everybody, my name is Kate and welcome to my channel. Trinergy awakens naturally, oh so naturally. It's first thing in the morning. However, last night I had a bunch of dreams and I wanted to make sure I got this message through. Seemed pretty urgent, so I like to follow when I'm asked inside my spirit and my soul to do something. I like to do it right whenever I am given that instruction, because generally speaking the time is opened up for me to do that, and there's a reason that it's called for. And every time that I act in those movements of do this whenever you know that you just need to do this, things are more synchronistic. So here we go with a download last night. This happened recently. And yet last night was just unpacking so much stuff. Energetically, we're at a very powerful time. However, the message is truth is truth. No matter what day of the year it is, it doesn't matter what time of year it is, it doesn't matter what year it is, it doesn't matter. None of that time is irrelevant in terms of truth. You know, gravity works the same whether it's a Monday, a Wednesday, 2,000 years ago, or today. So I'm working in that vein. So anyway, I woke up this morning remembering and having chewed on several times last night something that came up in a session that I did, a class that I facilitated recently at a prison. This is a federal prison, and these are, you know, career criminals for the most part. You don't have one-timers in there or one-offs, you know. The people that I work with mostly have been people that are on a short release. Within the next 5 years, they're going to be rehabilitated. They're in the rehabilitation process to go back into the natural world where they came from, and hopefully they're not going to go back to too natural a world of what they came from. They're going to learn something while they're in prison, while they're programming and learning how to change that environment, because wow, you know, something wasn't going well, so we need to change something. Well, the last class that I started recently has a different angle than what I have had before, which is okay. You know, I work with whomever I'm given. I don't believe in accidents, and I know that if someone's in front of my face or I'm in front of theirs, we've got something that we can share there. The teacher-student relationship is already established. It's a matter of how much am I learning in this, and what am I learning, and how much am I willing to teach, etc. And I'll determine that. So anyway, generally speaking, I'm dealing with men that these are all men, and that's just in the state I live. That's what the federal system has. Here, where I live close to me, is all male facilities. So the men that I've worked with traditionally have had, you know, drug issues, and it's a felony because there are guns involved. Generally speaking, weapons of some kind, but generally they're guns. So most of their charges are related to their terrible habits in terms of their drug use and their drug trafficking and, you know, means of violence, etc., for how they're going to get their job done. I'm not condoning bad behavior. Please do not misunderstand me. However, I also don't miss the opportunity to notice that humans are humans, and we all human, and we're all humaning badly in some area of our lives, or we have in the past, even if we've cleaned up. And so I'm passing no judgment on them. I don't want them passing judgment on me. It's a matter of saying, you know, judgment from the external factor for why you're here already has been made, so I don't have to stink on you. Why would I do that? I'm here to see if I can help you. So most of the men that I've come across, as I said, that's primarily their problem. However, don't think they don't have a history of abuse and neglect and just maltreatment and all kinds of nasty stuff, a lot of gang affiliation, things that you would expect, you know, a criminal element to be exposed to, poverty, lack of resources. However, I'm going to throw in there for my favorite, you know, beings out there that like to believe that it's a very particular race of individuals that are incarcerated. I'm going to have to put the kibosh on that and say, no, it's not. You know, I primarily see Caucasians. Honestly, I really do. And it doesn't matter what unit it is. It really doesn't, because I've worked with, you know, the high end, the people that are, you know, the golden children of the system. And I'm also, you know, friend to work with those that are not, those that are in even worse conditions and have done worse things. So this isn't a matter of making a statement about that all white people are good and all black people are bad, or vice versa. This is not an all or nothing. This is all people are people, and I leave it at that. So I notice very much so, though, because I come from a history of racism, heavy duty problems with making some real bad assumptions, they're all blah, that it's a race thing, and it's just simply not. So anyway, what I do find in my groups is that they typically, the tie-in and the buy-in is not in the race at all. It is, generally speaking, lack of resources, one parent, or neglect early on, unwanted pregnancy, multiple children, hungry, neglect of all kinds, don't have food, don't have clothing, do not have adequate resources to be taken care of on the basic human level, much less anything else, nurturing spirit, soul, mind, body, emotions, none of that. We don't have any of that going. We're barely living and, making our way. And the means by which they get their life done by the time they're 10, 11, 12 years old is shocking, appalling, and disgusting. However, that's just the common tie. People are not in a federal prison for no reason. They're not in a prison period for no reason. There's a lead up to that, and I like to chase that backwards and say disaster planning in EMS, which is where I got most of my training for understanding this, is to plan backwards and see how did this get started, and then we can see how we can predict this in the future and how we can pre-plan and then mitigate in the future any of this happening again. And that's where I come in, is to teach these men. Let's look at some of the factors, for how you were created, etc. And going forward, what kinds of things you can change in your mind, because you can't change your family, you cannot change your, your brotherhood, you can't change your gang, you can't change, what the past was, and you can't change anybody that doesn't want to have anything to do with you, because you cross the line with them to the point that they're done. So a lot of work gets done in a short amount of time. However, I'm there to crack open the mind, because the mind is where all of those blockages really, they originate there, that we're still operating under a paradigm where I didn't have enough food, I didn't have enough money, and I'll be damned if I'm going without now, and I'm 30 and I've been in prison for 12 years, and it doesn't look like I'm going to get out anytime soon. And so these are things that are highly important. So one of the things that ties into this topic today is that what would be the point of trying to rehab people that at any point, any one of these men can change their fate if they're in the honor unit, so to speak, and they're the golden children that are programming and have a target date within the next 2 to 5 years of their release. They can change that instantly with a bad decision. They can change that just fatally in a matter of seconds by moving outside of what the rules are. It's not any different in prison than it is in the civilian sector, that if you move outside the rules in prison, there's not ghetto gang rules in prison exactly the same way, not in a federal prison, not that I've seen myself, and I don't have any experience, elsewhere, so I can't say, but these people, go on ahead and screw the pooch on this, and you're going to know that you have. And so the people primarily, are pretty much invested in, look, I'm on the right track, I have a chance to redeem myself, and, this is what I would like to do. Now, whether they follow through with that, I have no way of knowing. I'm just there to put a chink in the armor and say, hey, you might want to think twice about doing that shit the same way. Otherwise, we might see each other again, or I might read about you in the paper. I sure would rather read about you for having made massive changes in your life and contributing back to society in a way that far exceeds anything and everything that you ever took from society. Please do that. However, the glass is half full, half empty. It's your choice. So one of the things that I recently had a man say to me that he's in for unaliving. I'm not fond of couching words. However, I guess I don't want to be too shocking. But yeah, let's say it like it is. He's in for murdering someone. And he just blithely said it. Most everybody else in the group is there for gun charges related to their trafficking, their meth habit, etc., which is pretty typical. But I don't get into the background. I don't do a case study on everybody. I just ask him, hey, would you like to share with me, why are you here? And that can mean a lot of things. So why are you here in prison? Why are you here on the planet? Why are you here in this class? Why are you here? And what is your existential understanding of this? Or what's your charges? I let them decide. They say, what do you mean? And I say, well, I don't know. Why don't you tell me whatever it is that comes to mind to tell me? And, generally speaking, it's kind of flipped over as just, I did bad things. Well, clearly, okay. But generally it's related to violence, guns, and drugs, has been the primary thing with, other stuff that I'm not going to get into people's background. If they don't tell me, I don't ask a lot of questions. I don't ask any in terms of that, because there's no need. I just try to get a lay of the land of what are you willing to tell me? What are you willing to share with me? And what am I intuitively reading, watching your body language and listening to you, and then putting that all together as we go through with the inconsistency that's going to happen more than likely, because these are people that feel a little bit probably defensive still, perhaps, about their position and why and how, etc. So it's a gentle process. However, it's an honest process, that you're already here. I don't have to determine what you've already been, convicted of. That's public record, and I ain't snooping. I'm waiting to find out more of you, your person, not the person who behaved so badly that you landed here and we're speaking, but the person of you. What would you like to share? And this one person, when it got around to his turn, that was the first thing he told me is what he was in for, and I said okay. And he was kind of waiting, I guess, and like, okay, one out of this group is something way more excessive than the others. Okay, what's your point? Well, it didn't really. I just let it fly and said, okay, thank you for letting me know, and we move on. And so later on in the conversation, he was the person. Now he seems like he's going to be the troublemaker of the class. He seems like he's going to be the one kind of front and stunting and wanting to start some shit. But again, I'm not going to make any predisposition in my mind of what I think is happening. I assess behavior as I see it happening and redirect it when I can. And, I've not ever had to have anybody removed from a class for their behavior or anything else, and I've not had anybody drop out either. So, they have an investment for being there. No matter what unit they're in, whether they're in the honor unit or not, they have an investment in programming because that helps them to earn points for, are you serious about moving out of this situation that you're in? Because whether you have a short time goal coming up or not, or whether you're in for life, would you like to better yourself and maybe start making those amends to yourself and to the people that you've caused harm? That's really what my angle is get right with yourself, because getting right with yourself is going to make your remaining days, whether you're in prison in a federal system or if you're in prison in your mind outside of the federal prison, it's going to make it so much better for yourself and humankind. So that's where I come from, is that there's nobody that can't afford to do some self-reflection. It doesn't matter where they're living or what their situation is. So this man, at some point, we were talking about high-level criminals, in criminal psychology, and I was talking about Jeffrey Dahmer and Ted Bundy, specifically, and Timothy McVeigh, all very violent people, all very violent crimes, and I don't condone any of it, not any of it. However, I had to speak of it. I did speak of it about the differences in the motivations for the crimes, and I won't go into all of that. There's no need. However, there's very clear distinctions for me of how and why things happened and what the buildup was to that, what the progression of the disease, so to speak, how that started and what the nexus was of those problems. And remember, disaster planning is about going back and seeing, how is this monster built over here? And they all track from, obviously a warped sense of reality, etc. At some point, the distortion started, and why and how were remarkably, notably very different, with many similar problems and issues, however, remarkably different in how those souls, those individuals chose to use their mind to deal with what their discrepancy in their heart and soul was. So, and in their mind, they dealt with it differently. And when we were speaking about that, this man, this problem child, as he was labeled, for me, I didn't say that, but that was what I heard after. It's like, yeah, he's probably the problem child, 1313. Like, okay, we'll see. If he is, remove him. That's fine with me. It's okay with me. I don't let people get under my skin. I'm here, to teach. And a student that doesn't want to learn something, I'm not gonna, do anything except not allow them to disrupt the class. However, he wasn't. So he turned to me, though. I'm very big about looking people in the eye. I find a lot of information in those eyeballs. I want to see exactly, hi there, what are you all about? And then listen, and watching the body language and everything else tells me a whole bunch. And so I was looking around the room, and he caught my attention, and he said, hey, what do you think about people? Do you think that anybody is just irredeemable? Which, that's a fairly 25-cent word. That's the other thing I want to be clear about, that our federal prison system, I don't see thousands of people at a time. However, the people I've seen so far, none of them are just outright as stupid as the general population would like us to believe. These are usually very well-versed and articulate men that I've worked with anyway. Only a few that really didn't seem to be capturing out of learning disabilities, etc. So anyway, this man said, do you think that there's anybody that's just irredeemable? There's no hope for them? And I looked at him and I said, Well, I said, that depends on what you consider irredeemable or hopeless. I said, and no, I don't think anybody's hopeless. However, I think if they think they're hopeless, then there is no hope for me to give to them. You have to be willing to believe something different. I said, what do you think about that? And I always like to let me see what you think, because there's a reason you're asking me. And I can be better serving, perhaps, if I know where disaster plan that. Where'd that come from? That you're already wondering if there's a hopeless person. I'm going to suspect that are you hopeless is probably what that means. Generally when we're speaking, we're fairly, egotistical about what we're saying in those kinds of situations, but we find a way, our ego finds a way to find a more pleasant way of gaining the information, which is normal. It's absolutely what we all do. Generally we don't even know we're doing it. It's unconscious and subconscious much of the time. And so I said, well, what do you think? Do you think that there's someone that just there's no redeemable value in them? And he says, well, I mean, like Jeffrey Dahmer or so and so. And I said, well, no, I absolutely don't believe that. I said, do I believe that every single person needs to be in general quarters with the rest of the world? I said, if that's what you're asking, then no, I do not. Do I believe it needs to be the system currently in play? I also do not believe that. However, no, I don't believe anybody's hopeless unless they themselves can never find the redeemable part of them, or they don't find the hope within them to believe that they're worthy of worthy in any way to anybody at all. And his eyes just kind of darted back and forth, and he said, well, I just want to say that my lawyer wanted it to be said that it's because of my terrible childhood, and all of this, and I just don't think that that's right, and I'm just a bad person or something along those lines. And as I told him that the three men that I mentioned, they all went to glory in different ways, and they all had different intentions for what they were doing and why they were doing what they were doing. And I didn't believe there was anybody hopeless in that crowd. As a matter of fact, 2 out of the 3 of them, I saw some stuff that to me said, wow, if there's going to be honor among thieves, this is the most honorable thing that person could say, to try to bring, some sort of accountability for themselves, or to try to bring some sort of sense of peace to themselves about what they were doing, how and why. And I'm not condoning the behavior. I'm just dealing with what is. The behavior already happened. How can we help you deal with this? Because from an energetic standpoint, anybody that I can help to bring resolution to the huge imbalance in them, the darkness is just really up there in them. Anybody that I can help, it helps the collective of humanity, and it relieves the suffering of that soul at least a little bit for a few minutes to open up and see that you weren't born this way. Nobody came out of the hatch completely out of the package like dark and dirty already, marked as the devil. Sorry, I don't believe that. There's no way that I'm going to. I believe we have systems that are karmically infused and that are charged and heavily weighted to be very dark and dark timelines and things. However, the reality is that we all come in and we're born as innocent babies with a neurological system and a brain that even if we're packaged to understand something different on an energetic level from some other dimension in some other lifetime and some other whatever, that we all still come in with the same neurological packaging of we've got to learn how to feed ourselves, how to walk, how to do whatever we're going to be able to do physically that we've been given the capacity to do, and to use our mind and our brain to that capacity also. So from that standpoint, it doesn't matter what downloads or what I might have been predisposed to do while I was here. If I'm never going to enact that part of my mind, that part of my DNA, that part of my energy, that part of whatever you call all of that, the Merkaba, whatever, if I'm never going to do that, if I keep myself in that, illusory state and I never seek that within me, then it really doesn't matter what my predisposition is. It's probably easier, I'm going to say, for the karmic stuff for people to fall into that dark energy because it's right there and they're souped and steeped in it and they're marinating in it, then it absolutely is easier to do that. However, what I've noticed in the classes I've taught with these people is that most of them, not all of them, Some of them won't make eye contact, and that's not hopeless in terms of if someone can make eye contact, you have hope. However, it's hopeless for that class for me if you won't even, engage the class. But they're still going to learn something just by being there and sitting in the energy that's shifting the dynamic. Whether they choose to accept that, embrace that, and move with it, that's up to them. However, they've been given an opportunity to see a different something and to feel a different way about themselves, even if they're not able, willing, or capable of participating in any marginal way that looks impressive to me. It doesn't have to look any way to me at all. Healing happens regardless. It's just a matter, I'd like people to wake up now if you can, stop that suffering, and let's alleviate the suffering you've already created. That's my angle. However, I don't have any control over what people do, how they wake up, when they wake up, if they want to, what their journey is, and all of that. I'm not into any of that, because in terms of telling somebody else what that is or what their schedule, if they're on one, none of it. You're in front of my face. We're teaching and learning together, back and forth, both sides of that, or we're not, and it is what it is, and it is all for good, no matter what, because my intention is to be there serving humanity in the way that I feel called to do that. And so because one of us is coming with very righteous intention, it doesn't matter what the other one's coming in doing. You're going to benefit, and I'm going to benefit, by learning those polarities and those extremes. So anyway, this man, I don't think he believes he has any redeemable value, because he said it's not my parents' fault, and yet whenever we talked a little bit later, he mentioned things that were horrific about his upbringing. So he kind of detached from making eye contact, put his head down and stuff, and he started in, with a whole thing about, well, it's not fair, and as I told him, look, the predisposition to come into a situation where you have no resources, you have, a lack of structure, you have poor parental structure with a parent absent, frequently with the father's job, may have not been intentional in terms of absent father altogether. However, if father is absent based on his job, then you have absent father issues, with an overwhelmed woman that cannot handle a precocious child. He labeled that as bad. 21 just passed. He labeled that as bad, and of course everybody else around him did too, because as children, when we don't know what to do and we're very sensitive, another thing I find with the men that I'm seeing is they're sensitive, and I don't mean as in they're squishy, they're girly. I mean they're highly sensitive to their environment, and they hardened up. Many of them, not all of them, they've hardened up to be able to cope with the life that they were dropped into. And so I see the most beautiful eyeballs sometimes that just, I go, oh yeah, there's a shaman deep in there. I don't say that out loud, of course. However, I can see that, and I can understand, the buildup and the etymology of how did this get created here, of you being in this system right here. And some of it has to do with I'm sensitive and I don't know how to deal with how I feel about this, and the only way that I can cope with the inconsistency, the lies, the physical aggression, the lack of food, that I don't have what I need, the bullying, the whatever it is to 22 just to turn that around, harden up, completely close off my heart chakra, get completely steeled up and vibranium tough, that nothing's going to really get me anymore. And then we start moving into those violent acts where the power is felt there rather than I had no power here, and I'm going to completely ignore my soul and my calling perhaps, then I'm going to need to find another way for me to do my life that is the opposite direction of any of that stuff that seems so mushy-gushy and stupid. And little kids, 2-3-year-old little boy, especially, with that parental oversight that's saying, act like a man. I'm 3, I don't even know what a man is, but okay, they're shoved into this paradigm very early on. The men that I work with specifically absolutely have that history, almost 100% in every class. However, this guy, he could not make that translation yet. He said, I don't think that the environment has anything to do with it. My lawyer tried to, tell them that it was based on the terrible childhood. I just don't believe that. Like, well, science tells us, I said, I'm not here to disagree with you if you don't feel like that's your story, of course. We have outliers on every continuum. Perhaps you're one of those outliers, that wasn't affected, or that was so deeply affected that you're hopeless. I don't know, but generally speaking, Jung and many other psychiatrists, psychologists, theorists, etc., behavioral analysts have come up with, this pretty tried and true system that's very scientifically proven that environment, nurture over nature, nurture and nature, that if you come predisposed for this stuff because you patterned, your family's patterned in years of abuse and violence, etc., and you have some karmic energetic input, then, your environment is going to tailor to that, and it can help to really ignite that. Can you pull out of that? I said, well, why do you feel that way? And he said, well, because everybody that was raised in a violent home isn't here. And I said, you're absolutely right. I'm here, and I'm not here, by my lack of choice. I'm here by my free will to be here. I said, I grew up in a violent home too. And you're right, I didn't choose to do what you've done. However, it doesn't mean that I didn't struggle, I didn't make terrible decisions, and that I didn't cause harm. It's just that I didn't go to that extreme. However, it doesn't mean anything other than I made it out and you didn't, so you're right about that. However, here's what science tells us. And he was really somehow confused by that, and it occurred to me that more than likely that's a protective stance, to keep the mother figure in his life, somewhat protected, because he does still speak to her, and stay in touch with her, because that communal need to be out of isolation. That's why we make these decisions that we do, to stay in places where this doesn't really feel the greatest. However, this is the only place I'm accepted. This is the only place where I feel like I'm, okay, or that I'm good. And we start adjusting to what the good standard is around us. And that kind of blew his mind, that, good is really, not or nice is not those aren't the words and the adjectives that I like to go with how I'm going to model, what my behavior was, what I learned, and what I saw demonstrated around me, and what was expected of me, and what the standard was. I'm going to categorize that it was unfreaking healthy, and it didn't feel good. I can definitely say that. However, modeling that behavior still into adulthood did not serve me. It was still unhealthy, and it was not a good experience for the people around me. It doesn't matter if a federal prison is where I landed or not, as in I'm unwillingly here, or I step in here to teach other people how not to be here. Start with your mind. So he was correct that he couldn't quite get over the black and white thinking of it's nature or nurture. I was born a villain, and I said, how could you possibly be born a villain when you came out of the same hatch as me, in terms of we all come through the same system of birth through our mother, and we all come out with an operational brain of some kind, into the capacity that we can use that, develop it, etc. That's all different. However, we're all packaged the same way fairly consistently, with some, irregularities, but anything too far off the baseline will not survive. So the basic packaged human is what it is, and it's a matter of how do we do what we need to do as we go through our lives, and cope with what the good standard was back then versus what the good standard, what the healthy standard is today. And somehow, excuse me for that break, I'm running out of phone storage. So anyway, it challenged him, because it meant that he was going to have to take responsibility for the fact that, yes, nature, nurture, and your environment, you want to blame it, it's all my fault, and yet can't really get past the fact that it really is your decision, and yet you're not really quite taking that authority, because you're still tied to believing that it's actually not that your environment, and yet you're not taking responsibility. Is it your environment or not? That, oh, I'm just a bad person, is what he said. Maybe I'm just a villain, maybe I'm awful. Oh, I see. So we're just not going to take accountability, and we're also not going to put it where, our family dynamic was unhealthy and toxic as fuck. We're not going to put it there, because there's too much vulnerability in that. Totally get it. However, we're also not going to be willing to really say, well, if it isn't my environment, and it's, I have the choice, I could have broken out, and I'm not a villain. How could I break out if I'm a villain? Well, that broke his brain, and shortly thereafter, it didn't crack him open as in he lost his mind. I could just see he kind of glazed out and went, oh, that's going to take you a little bit, and you might drop out of this class. I don't know. We'll see, how this goes after this session. We'll see how the next sessions go with you. We'll see how that works. But he couldn't quite, he'd settled on his mind that it couldn't possibly be his mom. it must be, and it couldn't possibly be the environment. It has to be that I was just born this way. And I'm, they're saying, well, no, actually, that's not in fact true. I don't think that we've ever, I'm sure we haven't ever proven, in any way, because there's no way we can yet. We haven't found that, villain gene just yet, that there are predisposers, absolutely, family history, etc. However, it's a combination of what the chemistry, biology, and anatomy and physiology and brain stuff tells us, as well as the environment. And no matter what, dude, you weren't born a villain. We do not have proof that villains are, carry this particular gene. If we did, wow, I'm sure there'd be some interesting way to take care of that. However, that kind of cracked his mind with, oh yeah, how would you say that somebody's, born an awful person? How does that happen? And especially when you can see that the buildup of this, the seed that was planted here, is, how that may have gone, disaster plan that backwards. And some people just are not in a place where they're going to really want to assume the full brunt of, you don't get to just rest on your laurels with you were born this way. That is in fact not true. It's not scientifically proven. However, that was what he could cope with hearing that day. And I'm not going to push him any further, nor did I. I could see he kind of glazed out, and then he started putting his head down. And towards the end of the class, I engage the entire class always, and I'm not going to, have shade with somebody who's having trouble coping with the fact that, yeah, that's not really going to fly with me. It can fly with you, that's your life and your mind and your understanding. However, I'd like you to know, what the full understanding scientifically is, with how you can work with your heart and your mind, with some information that might be more helpful to understand the glass is half full or the glass is half empty. And if we look in the empty side of it, we'd say, well, I'm just born a villain. Well, if we look at the it's full, half full, is that, okay, you were born into a villainous situation where 333, you could have easily created what you created, which was a villain type situation within yourself. However, that it's not really okay that you would believe or rest on any kind of understanding of yourself that there was no hope for me from the beginning. That takes a lot of grief work, shadow work, and a whole lot of realization of reality of where we've come from. Sometimes it's hard for people to digest, much less, even think about to take the bite in the first place, to swallow, because that's a lot. That has to say, well, if I'm just keep getting interrupted, excuse me. So if I'm not awful, then it must be something else. My behavior has been awful. There is no excuse for the things that have been done. I'm not saying that, and I'm not giving a hood pass to anybody at all, especially in a federal prison. I don't give myself any. It's just that we have to get real about what we're talking about, and we have to get real about where we're asking for a hood pass, and that hood pass doesn't exist. There is no such thing as to just toss it off to you, well, I was just born evil. Yeah, no, and that's not what science tells us. I said, you can disagree. You absolutely can. And I tell them that at the beginning of the class, always, every class, that I'm here to, speak the truth as I understand it, from my perspective of my truth. And I'm also here to tell you the truth, the most scientifically based, models of theory and understanding of human behavior, human dynamic, and human psychology that I know. And, if you've got something more up to date, and more radically accepted since the last time I checked this stuff, please let me know. But I always open up the floor to, I'm giving you the perspective of science and my truth as I live my life in those understandings and the principles of, my spiritual practices, which I don't bring into the discussion with them. However, that is what I bring, is the truth of what I know of universal law, etc. And we don't get into the discussion of the karma they're receiving for having done what they've done, etc. However, we do need to talk about the hard science. And so if you disagree, and he did, I have to disagree with you with that. Okay, and that's fine. He could handle, and he did very well with respecting the fact that you disagree with me. However, this is a flat earth theory, that your reality is what it is. However, science tells us this is, really not flat, and that your postulation of you being awful cannot be supported, is not so far supported by scientific theory or practice understanding or, decades of research, and empirical studies, so longitudinal studies. We really can't support you. I can't support you in that because science doesn't support you in that. However, I respect people that have a flat earth theory, though I don't talk to them and engage with them. That's a little more outside my work than I can handle, and it would be unnecessary to try to follow him in his misunderstanding of what I know to be true, and science tells me that, it would be difficult and wrong to try to push him around within his theory and within his model. I'm not there to crack people open and kill them. I'm there to, you know, put chinks in the armor of the mind and those defense mechanisms, which is also highly studied. And if you work with them well, you can help people kind of break down that ego. However, I found it absolutely fascinating that, you know, we just toss people off to, well, I'm just awful. Well, cool, then you're going to be released back on the street in how many years, you know, in the next 5 to 10. I'm going to want you to really rethink that, because if you fall back on believing that that's an okay excuse, because science tells me that that would be a justification or an excuse that you're not willing for your lawyer to bring up, you know, because you're just a villain. Ooh, that's going to possibly already predisposes you as a labeled felon who's going to be under suspicion and highly, you know, watched and monitored by everybody that knows that, maybe. And then you're more likely to be pushed into situations, provoked into situations, and hang out in situations where you're going to be called upon to reach your higher mind. And if you already believe 333 that you're a villain, then that's going to torpedo that decision into possibly going very dark, very early, very quickly, and without even any consideration whatsoever. So my angle isn't necessarily to change his mind. I don't have the power to do that. I only have the power to bring the reality of what we're talking about here, and case studies, lots of history, and my understanding of how to work with human beings who are in vulnerable populations and highly disenfranchised populations, and have been since the jump, most of them. I've not yet met one prisoner who came from a high-end family with a lot of support that did not also have some real freaky mitigating factors in it that made that shit really strange and awful for them. So even the few that I've seen that came from good families with money, etc., I would need to do a whole case study of, let's go Carl Jung with this and lie down and tell me nothing. I don't need to know. I can see where you are, and I can watch the patterns of the defense mechanisms, etc. However, the case study would be interesting to see that perhaps. So anyway, that seemed so important to have to get off my chest today, so I did, and I'm going to be on my way with my day. I hope that you enjoy your day no matter what part of the day you're in, and remember to get within your skin, because you're divine. It is absolutely fine, and it understands human psychology just fine, because it's otherworldly. We come from some other something, and that gets into a whole philosophy that I don't get into too much with prisoners. However, the philosophy of me is that I come from, you know, the cosmic soup that isn't human, so it has to be greater in understanding than me, and I don't anthropomorphize anything in divinity. I call that something that, you know, continually feeds me the understanding of me, because it's more known, you know, of what I am than what I know of it. And so I allow that to inform me, to help me make more righteous decisions that are healthy for me, that feel good in my body, you know, and I mean a righteous goodness, not, you know, take a pill or eat a food that temporarily feels good. I like things that really feel right in my body and make my body and my mind and my soul, my skin, everything and part of me. I like to make decisions and do things that serve that, so that I can serve my community without being angry, without being triggered, without being mad, and without blaming anybody else, and without taking any blame or accountability that isn't mine, so that I can more righteously stand in my courage and my ability to take the accountability that is mine. So anyway, as I said, get within your skin, because you're divine. It's absolutely beautiful, absolutely lovely, and totally fine. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you again next time. Mwah. Goodbye, my friends.